So we've talked a lot about in terms of designing your team, both composition, goals. Let's do a quick recap of some of the key concepts and principles that we've talked about as part of this first session. One of the things we talked about was team size. Too big, too small, just right. There are trade-offs in terms of as your team gets too large, some of those process and coordination costs. But then if too small, you're not really taking the full advantage of that team. And so one of the things you're going to want to think about is how big is your team? And does it fit into that sweet spot of, say, 5 to 10 members of your team? If it's larger than that, what are the costs? If it's smaller than that, are you really taking advantage of that team concept to drive results for your organization? We talked about both surface and deep level diversity, demographics, personality, values. We talked about the concept of perceived person-group fit. We also talked about some of the fault lines that exist in teams when you have either surface or deep level attributes that are creating some of these fault lines in the group where people are different on multiple dimensions, but you have these subgroups and how that can create some conflict or lack of coordination in your team. So you have to be very, very careful on those demographic fault lines. And then team goals. We talked about some of the trade-offs with learning performance goals, how important shared commitment is to some of those goals. So I want you to remember these key concepts in terms of designing your team. Some very simple, team size, some much more complex in terms of composition with respect to surface and deep level diversity. And some of those best practices for how to establish really effective goals in your teams. Those are the key concepts in terms of designing your team that you want to keep in mind. In our next session, we'll come back and talk about team structure, both formal structures and informal structures, and how important those structures are for driving results and performance in your team, and some of the best practices that you can use to create effective structures for your team going forward.